Weird games are kind of my thing. Granted, I have very specific tastes in games, so I don't love a ton of weird games, but a lot of my favorite games are weird. Phantom Betula is a great example of one of my top 10, a weird and surreal existentialist horror masterpiece. Speaking of Phantom Betula, actually, that game evokes the vibes of the game LSD Dream Emulator quite intentionally, which is another weird game. LSD Dream Emulator is a PS1 game centered around exploring dreamscapes and observing all they have to offer. It's a series of abstractions, images without clear meaning, and open text to be deciphered at your leisure. In many ways it reminds me of Yume Nikki, though the two are still quite different in how they ultimately come together. LSD Dream Emulator is far from the only strange and obscure game that found its home on the PS1, and I don't need stuff like Final Fantasy VIII as strange as that game is. Another great example is Tale of the Sun. What Tale of the Sun is exactly is hard to define. It's a caveman survival game that's extremely cryptic and brutally difficult. Finding food is the key to survival, and if you die even once, you lose all your progress. It's really experimental and strange, and I appreciate that a ton. Of course, there's a lot of strange survival horror RPG hybrids here too. Parasite Eve isn't exactly obscure, but Dee and Kodelka certainly are. Kodelka in particular's restrained abstract horror and beautiful voice acting lead to an atmosphere that's uncomfortable in all the right ways. In a way reminiscent of its masterful contemporary Silent Hill. And of course there's The Silver Case, the visual novel exploration hybrid that kinda reminds me of Ace Attorney and how its investigative gameplay systems work. I won't go into more detail than that because Suda51, the game's creator, and I are not on good terms right now. And who could forget the beautiful Woolsey mess that is Shadow Madness? As you can see, there are a plethora of these strange games on the PlayStation 1. Games that were incredibly unique in their aspects, from survival horror RPGs to visual novel dungeon crawler hybrids. But why is the PS1 so inundated with them? There are a few factors that are at play here in order to make these games so distinct, advantages that other console generations didn't really get to have. For starters, the PlayStation was the first 3D console to be produced. There was no standard of 3D game development for people to live up to yet, and though one would quickly be created, it was still hard for people to learn all the new hardware, leading to a lot of bizarre ideas coming to light from these difficulties. The jump from 2D game development to 3D required a lot of different tools to be made that were completely foreign to those who had worked on 2D games, and the adjustment was incredibly tough. I mean, it shows up in the scenes of even the most standard early 3D games. Super Mario 64 is a lot different than the previous entries in terms of its structure because the N64 simply couldn't hold as many levels if they were all completely 3D. So Mario 64 went from a large set of linear levels to a series of objective-based playgrounds and completely redefined what a Mario game could be. The new hardware was a struggle to work with, so many previous ideas of what games were had to be thrown out, thus leading to more ambitious titles. It was hard to know what was worth investing in. Another huge factor was the lack of budget necessary to work on projects like this. While obviously still an expensive venture, I mean just look at the inflated budget of Final Fantasy VII, it definitely costs a lot less to make a PS1 game than it does to make a game on hardware that would come later. I think that this led to mainstream developers being more willing to experiment. The financial stakes were lower. So if something like, say, Aquanauts Holiday failed, which it kind of did, it wasn't a big deal for Sony. Producing video games was a much less expensive affair. Finally, there's the huge install base of the PS1. The PS1 is still one of the best-selling consoles of all time even today, surpassing the amount of sales of the Wii at 104 million copies. With a larger population of people who own the console, more potential buyers for your game emerge. It's pretty simple. Developers were attracted to the console at the time where they would get the most eyes on their product. So those are my brief speculations and musings on why there are so many weird games on the PS1, whether it be due to budget, or a lack of knowledge about 3D spaces, or the huge install base, or all three. Regardless of whether or not any of them are completely accurate, those are just the conclusions I've come to from thinking about it. No matter what the reason, the PS1 is a really special console, and some of my favorite games of all time came from it. Hopefully one day I find out why for sure. This has been Arcade Everlasting, who really just wanted an excuse to use Kodelka footage in a video, signing off. Thank you for watching.